Hello and welcome. I'm Cameron Bailey, the Artistic Director and Head of TIFF. As you join us today for this talk, we encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on and its history. Here in Toronto, I'm located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. This is territory that's within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and it's home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're grateful to be working on this land and to be telling the stories of Indigenous filmmakers and sharing their stories every chance we get. I want to extend a sincere thank you to some of the people and organizations who make everything we do possible. Our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and our major supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto for all of their continued support. I also want to welcome and thank our Every Story Fund supporters. This group recently came together to collectively support Every Story People's Fellowship, which will fund one place in our 2022 Filmmaker Lab at next year's festival for a creator from an equity-seeking community. Thanks also to the founding partner, NBC Universal, who matched every donation. Today, we're here to learn a little bit about the history of anti-Blackness in the world of Canadian film and entertainment, and also how that reflects outward toward the larger film world. It's a topic that makes me think about the importance of the Every Story Fund, which provides opportunities and space for marginalized creators in this industry so we can create the change that we need to see. The Every Story People's Fellowship is just one step in our plan to become a leader in creating change in the film industry. And thank you for making that happen. So let's go back 75 years. It's November 8th, 1946, Nova Scotia Movie Theatre. This is where Viola Desmond made a historic stand against racial segregation. To commemorate the 75th anniversary of her action and the subsequent court case, we proudly present this conversation with Dr. Cheryl Thompson about Viola Desmond and racism in the film industry then and how things are now as well. If you're in Toronto, we also invite you to join us in person tonight, November 8th, for a special screening of the documentary Subjects of Desire by Jennifer Holness. And that's a documentary about Black women in film and the representation of Black women on screen. For more information on that, you can go to tiff.net. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest. Dr. Cheryl Thompson is an assistant professor in creative industries at the Creative School. She's the author of Uncle, Race, Nostalgia, and the Politics of Loyalty, that's from this year, and of Beauty in a Box, Detangling the Roots of Canada's Black Beauty Culture from 2019. Dr. Thompson is currently working on her third book on Canada's history of blackface as performance and anti-Black racism. In collaboration with the Toronto-based film company Pink Moon Studio, Dr. Thompson is co-producing a feature documentary film on Canadian blackface. Dr. Cheryl Thompson, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I want to go back to 1946 in the Roseland Theatre in Nova Scotia, talk a little bit about what it was like to be a Black filmgoer at the time. What, in your understanding of the context for Viola Desmond, what was it like for Black moviegoers in Nova Scotia back in the mid-1940s?
So in the mid-1940s, just like it would have been across Canada, we had essentially segregated theaters. It was segregated by code and custom. So it's not like there was a sign saying, Black people can only sit here, or they would have called us Negroes back then. But there was a unspoken rule that you sat in the balcony. So the balcony of most theaters would have been where not just Black people, but also other racialized groups probably would have sat in the balcony, whereas the main flooring would have been reserved for white people. And so because this was an unspoken rule and some theaters were not like that, right? You almost had to know where to go. You had to know the codes and conventions.
Well, I'm interested in that because these weren't kind of clear Jim Crow laws like we may know of in the U.S., but there was an understanding, I suppose, that if you were Black and you were going to a movie, that you wouldn't sit on the main floor, you wouldn't sit in a kind of integrated way with white moviegoers. But how would you know? How would that be enforced, even if it's unspoken?
Well, I think, before, I would say really maybe the 90s ish, Black communities were very connected through custom and just knowing the neighborhood. So, say if you were a Black person coming to town, say via the railway, right? If you were a railway porter or connected to the porters, you would then go to the Black club or go to the Black church, and people would kind of give you the lay of the land, where to go to get this, where to get your hair done, where to buy this item. So there was a lot more of community exchange and a lot more of people just sort of an underground network of information. I think that's the best way I can describe it. So people knew, in the absence of things being promoted in the newspapers or things being in the dominant culture, that they had a cultural group that would tell them the ins and outs.
The mid-1940s is also right in the middle of what's called kind of the golden age of classical Hollywood. All of the big movie genres, romances and melodramas and horror movies and action films and westerns, those were all very active at the time. In most cases, Black people were not present, but things were about to change in terms of Black cast films being made by Hollywood. There were, of course, independent Black films being made by people like Oscar Micheaux and Spencer Williams. But what would have been available to Black moviegoers around the time of 1946 here in Canada? Would they have ever seen themselves on screen?
Yeah, of course. I don't think they would have seen themselves in Canadian produced films. So, these are American Hollywood produced imports that are coming in. And, the 1940s is sort of the moment in Hollywood where, for the first time, there's that break from the plantation themed movie, right? Or for the first time, there's sort of a break also from seeing Black women and men only playing maids or the porter or the bellhop or the shoe shine boy. Like, if you really go back and look at Hollywoods in the 1930s and 20s, that was basically it. Then the 40s happened, especially 1942-3. And suddenly, I always try to explain this. I think it's also in the ether, because politically speaking, in the 1940s, there was change. For the first time during World War II, you had African Americans enlisting, right? They didn't have to enlist necessarily in all Black battalions. So you had a kind of integration was slowly taking place. And so by the time you get into especially the mid 40s, especially with Lena Horne, who really was the Black starlet of the 1940s with Stormy Weather, Cabin in the Sky, and various other films, then Hazel Scott, who's showing up in Rhapsody in Blue and other kinds of like movies that quote unquote for the dominant culture. I think in the 1940s, Black audiences for the first time are being exposed to Black themed films. We can now critique from today's vantage point the content of those films and if it really reflected Black community, but nonetheless, they would have started to see Black people in film in leading roles. And I think that's the key part. But with the exception of, again, I mentioned Hazel Scott. Hazel Scott was another one of those actresses who was coming up. When they showed up in a film, often it was just to sing a jazz number. And they didn't have any substantive like role in the actual movie.
The movie would stop and then you'd have the jazz number, and jazz was very popular. Swing was very popular at the time, and many Black musicians were quite celebrated, but there was no dance. There was no way of kind of integrating them into the story because of segregation, because of the racism that existed. And so you would just stop the movie and have the number.
Yeah, so even the Nicholas brothers, an amazing jazz, and they were always backed up by a jazz band. So we can think of all the major jazz leaders of that era, right? Like Count Basie and Duke Ellington and all these like really Cab Calloway. So jazz made a big jump onto the big screen in the 1940s. And so the Nicholas brothers would take up like 10 minutes in a jazz routine that by today's standard, you watch that back and you're thinking, was that shot in one take? Because it looks like it was one take. And somebody told me that they often didn't do multiple takes of those dance routines. They literally, that was one take when you saw the 10 minutes and they're going around the stage. And there's that amazing clip of, I can't remember the film, where they literally leap up
Yes,
the steps and then they
down the stairs.
slide
Yeah.
down and do the splits. I
Hmm.
mean, so you can imagine if you're a Black person in the 1940s watching a movie like that,
Yeah.
seeing Black talent in that way, which even though, yes, they didn't have a substantive role in the movie, there was still Black expression that was coming into theaters that you had never seen before the 1940s.
Hmm. Now, on November 8th, 1946, Viola Desmond was not in her home community. She had gone on a business trip and drove. Car broke down, and she decided to pass the time as she was waiting for the repairs by watching a movie. And let's remember, movies were the predominant entertainment form at that time. It was what everybody did, often every week. So she goes to see a movie, and the movie she goes to see is The Dark Mirror, by Robert Schoedemak, a psychological thriller with the big star of the time, Olivia de Havilland. This is, I kind of have this picture in my mind of her walking in. Maybe it's not a full house or anything. It seems like it wouldn't have had a ton of people there. And she sits down to watch this movie. And can you talk a little bit about what that experience might have been like for her? Black women going to watch white women's stories, a Black woman not in her home neighborhood, so not surrounded by her community, going to watch a film by herself.
Yes, and just a side note, I actually watched that film
Yes.
relatively recently,
Mhm.
and one, it's kind of an amazing film. It
Mhm.
really is a psychological drama, but I can imagine that at the time Viola Desmond was watching this film, like many people, when you watch a film, as soon as those lights go out, you get engrossed in the narrative of the film, and you start to just lose your sense of place. Like, and I can imagine her actually enjoying the film and then feeling that tap, tap, tap.
Yes.
And then wondering like, oh, what now kind of thing, right? And just when it was getting good, I bet you, because there's a part in that movie where it really takes a turn and it starts to get really good and you're enthralled in the narrative. So I don't think it was necessarily uncommon for Black women to go to the movies by themselves. I think as many people who have grown up with movies, often it's a pastime thing. And especially in the 1940s, movies were very cheap. Okay.
Mhm.
Like, you had like weeklies coming out, like there were so many movies and they were very cheap. So I think what really might have got her head spinning was how much of her narrative kind of mirrored the narrative of that film, in the sense of that film is all about someone's entanglement with police. Not to give it away, but that's
Yes.
a big part of the narrative. And she might have been thinking, oh my goodness, is this my life being turned into a movie? Because here I am now being entangled in this police drama when all I was trying to do was watch a movie.
Right. And of course, she was seen as being in the wrong place at the wrong time by sitting on the main floor, the orchestra section, as opposed to the balcony section where Black people and, as you said, other racialized communities were relegated, which is, being in the wrong place is often a kind of a Hollywood plot as well. So interesting to see how that kind of mirrored. Now, in terms of just, a little bit more about the 1940s experience of film generally, because before we leap forward and closer to the present, I want to just see if we can understand a little bit more about how that evolution of Black performers, Black stories was changing. As I said before, there was a kind of a culture of Black-made films, very low-budget independent films that circulated just within Black communities, going back to the silent era. But there were also struggles of people like Paul Robeson who were really trying to find characters appropriate to him to play on screen and just really not finding it possible. And as you said, until people like Lena Horne turned up, it was very rare that Black actors took leading roles. So can you tell us a little bit more about where the mid-1940s finds us in that evolution, say, between the very racist early films in the silent era up through, say, the breakthroughs that began to happen in the 1950s and 60s?
I mean, I think first thing to understand is that Hollywood in the 1940s was also taking a lot of chances with technology in terms of the cinematography, right? So you have like the most arguably known film to mark the decade, which is Song of the South, that was really a technological marvel because it was live animation and feature, right? And it was like just a marvel, and it was all in color. So the 40s is the beginning of Hollywood films being colorized. And I think that too was also in the post-World War II era. You have the opening up of the global market. So you really have the exportation of these Hollywood major studio production films that are now being exported to parts of the world. And at the same time, why that's a moment for Black culture is now Black images are being circulated around the globe at a much higher rate that they would have been in the 30s and 20s, and also in color. And if they're not in color, you take Lena Horne. What made Lena Horne such a huge star in the 40s is that she also happened to come up with Ebony magazine in 1945, and the glossy Black magazine and the glossy beauty person being on the cover of those magazines. And so now you have Lena Horne as not just a film star, she's also part of the beauty industry, commodity culture, right? This is the beginning of sort of that multi-brand celebrity that we see today that we kind of take for granted, like a Beyonce is everywhere. In the 1940s
as well. Yeah, there's so many of them now.
There's so many. In the 1940s, like Lena Horne was it. She was that person who was showing up on the magazines, in film, doing interviews and being in ads. And so I think what happens in the 40s is that you have two versions of Blackness that are being sort of imported around the world. You have these Black-centered films. Most of them are still in black and white. Most of them are still basically centered around music, right? I mean, I think of Cabin in the Sky, and there's that huge number, and it's like, okay, this is kind of like, is this all we can do? And then you have Hollywood and the musical animation that is putting out kind of still that antiquated image of Blackness, right? Either we're playing mammies and uncles, or again, we're kind of menials. I'm always thinking of It's a Wonderful Life. That movie also made in the 40s. I can't remember the exact date, so I won't give it, but it's a Christmas classic, right? Christmas time, it's always played. If you pay attention in that movie, there is a Black character in that movie. There are two of them, right? One of them is essentially a mammy, right? And the other one is a sleeping car porter who takes out the luggage when at the train station.
Right.
In the 1940s, you still had those characters. They didn't just go away because you had Lena Horne, right? They kind of coexisted in the marketplace.
Interesting that Ebony magazine was starting out then, and the idea of Black glamour was being popularized because, of course, Viola Desmond herself was a pioneer businesswoman in the beauty industry, and I wonder if there's something there in terms of, you know, she herself being part of a rise in Black entrepreneurship centered around beauty, centered around, you know, making people look good and feel good about how they look, and then going to the movies maybe for inspiration sometimes, trying to see some of the latest styles and, you know, what Lena Horne and others would have been sporting on screen, and bringing that back into her business.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the iconic image of Viola Desmond that we all know, she's actually wearing a hairstyle that's known as a page boy. And a page boy hair, I know this because of my book, Beauty in a Box, where I talk all about the hairstyles in the 1940s, because that was actually also the era where you have hair weaves, like the business of hair weaves. Even though it really starts in the 50s, in the 40s, you have a lot of the importation of hair actually starts in the 40s. And so that style, page boy, often required the use of sort of like just a little few hair pieces at the back to give it a fullness. So Lena Horne also wore that hairstyle in the 40s for a bit. So that hairstyle kind of came to symbolize middle class respectability. Right. And if you were a middle class or not, even if you were trying to project middle classness, you would have worn that hairstyle, and it would have signaled beauty. Because if you look through the pages of Ebony magazine in the 1940s, you are going to see that same variation on that hairstyle. So there was the page boy, there's cluster curls, and there's like various variations on that same style. And they were basically standard. I think, you know, and one of the things to realize is that what film did, if we think about it in the absence of television, in the absence of social media, of the internet, you can think of film as a huge Instagram. Film was the Instagram of the era. If you saw something on film, you were trying to go out and get it. Yeah. And you were going to ask, where can I get this? So everybody was kind of looking for the Lena Horne look.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many stars from that classical era that influence whole generations of style, whether it's, you know, it's Marlon Brando's T-shirt or Veronica Lake's hair or whatever it might be. And, you know, everybody would go and try to duplicate that look. And they were the influencers and the movie stars and you know, also on the covers of the magazines. So the power of the movies, I think, is really important to emphasize, because all of these other media just weren't there at the time in the same way.
That's right. In fact, when we get into the 50s, many people credit Audrey Hepburn with the low crop hairstyle for I think it was An American in Paris. That's that right. Movie, that hair, her wearing her hair like that literally freed women to cut their hair. Because before that era, the last time they had cut their hair was in the 1920s. After the 20s, yes. Most women,
and others, yeah.
Right. So film was the major socializing agent of that era in the absence of television.
Now, I think many people know Viola Desmond's story in that she was tapped on the shoulder and told she was sitting in the wrong section, asked to move, and ended up in a police custody and a lawsuit in terms of being forced to pay the 1 cent additional fine or being charged with that. That didn't get addressed or corrected until decades later. And I want to maybe just, you know, make that leap from 1946 to the present, when the Nova Scotia government and Premier acknowledged the mistake that was made, not just a mistake, but a kind of a miscarriage of justice in charging her for sitting in a place that was reserved even without a law for white moviegoers. So I want to maybe, if we can jump forward to our present era, and it's really only been about 10 years or so that Viola Desmond's been known in Canadian popular culture, and now she's on the $10 bill. What do you think are the significant changes in terms of Black movie going now? I mean, I remember going out to see movies specifically at places like Scarborough Town Center or the Eaton Center, because you knew there would be a concentration of Black moviegoers if you were going to go and see a Black movie, and you wanted that experience because it was different than going to a movie with an audience that predominantly was not Black. What if you could talk a little bit about the evolution of Black moviegoing, spectatorship, there's the space that Black moviegoers take up now in Canada as opposed to in 1946?
Yeah, I mean, like you, I also went to those places, and I can't leave out the former Cedar Brae Mall, the Cedar Brae Cinema. That was the place to go, and out in Scarborough. So I think you have to look at it as, I think the 90s was a moment. The 90s was a very unique moment, because you didn't just have Black-centered films in the 90s, you had Black directors directing those films, right? And there was a certain dynamic, and it was just the 80s and the 90s to a large extent. I think 2000s and where we are today, it's a more complicated story, because Hollywood is more complicated. You know, you have a much more focus on the global distribution of film and sort of where films are going to be seen, and sort of I think the blockbuster movies have kind of really done something to narrative driven films. It's much harder to see, because a lot of Black movies are going to be narrative driven, right? They're not going to have a lot of special effects. It's going to be a story that's centered in a place. And I think that's why Moonlight was a moment, because it was such a quiet film in many ways. You know, if you watch that movie, there's a lot of moments of just no sound at all. It's just visual. And I think that shocked people that it did so well, because it seemed to just be counter to the moment. And yet we haven't seen another Moonlight since in the same, right, aesthetic.
Not in the same. Well, there are very few filmmakers like Barry Jenkins. His own films, of course, have come, and there've been Steve McQueen's films and others, and Ava DuVernay's and others. But there was something particular about Moonlight. I remember back in the 90s going to see Spike Lee's movies, or John Singleton's, or Mary Van Peebles, and you would go as a kind of an occasion, right? That when there was a new Black movie and you wanted to kind of have that full experience, you would go with Black friends and family and try to be among other Black people to watch. It was a very different experience than I imagine Viola Desmond would have had on the regular. But, you know, you're still watching Hollywood spectacle. And, you know, I think the last time this happened in a big way was with Black Panther, of course. And, you know, here in Canada and in the US and any place that there are large Black communities, people saw that as a big moment of kind of coming together again. I want to maybe ask you about the flip side of that, you know, the Hollywood spectacle, and even just how pleasurable that can be compared to, say, the Black Canadian stories that are being told by filmmakers like Charles Officer, Clement Virgo, Kelly Fife Marshall, Karen Chapman, and others, who are making, you know, right now short films or debut features in many cases, not always getting the distribution that the big Hollywood films do. And how are we as Black people here in Canada getting access to stories on the big screen that come from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough question, because I think it depends. You know, it's also kind of a regional conversation, because I know there's filmmakers out west, you know, out east, in the middle, and everyone's telling kind of a different story. I think what all Black filmmakers are up against in Canada, right, is that the filmic representation of Blackness has so been dominated by the African American story that it is really hard to imagine a different representation of Blackness, even within our own market, right? That people are going to register that this is a different story coming from a different place and space. And I even think of Black British actors and directors. They're basically telling American stories. They're kind of like, there isn't really a Black British film story that you really get to access on a scale. So I think in Canada, we're up against the same thing. But what I will say is that I know that there are a lot of really amazing Black Canadian independent filmmakers who are doing the work. They're not trying to make a big studio production. Like you said, they're doing short films. They're doing real indie films that maybe will only screen at a festival or screen at certain events. They might not even enter the theater circuit at all. And I think as much as we place so much focus on Hollywood films and the big millions of dollars, we have to understand that cultural production itself is important. It's not just about making the millions and millions and millions of dollars. The fact, if you are a group of people who are not producing yourself and representing yourself in the cultural landscape, it's almost a form of self-annihilation. It's like you cease to exist. And I think this generation of Black Canadians are finally starting to realize that, you know, we actually have to start producing ourselves and telling our stories, or else we just don't exist anymore. Whether those stories get taken up in the global film distribution network, and, you know, your Black Canadian story can be screened in Tanzania or Brazil, I mean, that's another conversation, right? But I think we have to still encourage the act of doing it. And for too long, I think Black Canadian filmmakers were discouraged to just not do it. Because, you heard all the list of why not to do it. It's too hard. You're not going to get distribution. People don't understand Black Canadian stories. I think we just have to stop listening to that noise and keep doing it. Because the more you keep doing it, the more Canada can actually produce a Barry Jenkins of our own. And I'm sure we actually already have.
I think we have. Absolutely.
That's right. We just don't get the promotion that we deserve.
On that, there is now a Black Screen Office, which was just recently formed in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests and lobbying that had been going on for many years in this country. Joan Jenkinson heads it, a Black woman, and they have a mandate to try to increase the number and the range and the scale of Black screen stories in Canada. You now have TV series like Digstown as well, which are centered around a Black woman. And I'm imagining, Viola Desmond transported from 1946 in that movie theater, and then maybe just, not having to go out to a movie necessarily, coming home at night from running her salon and turning on the TV, and there's Digstown right in her own living room. And, what's changed when you imagine what, the gap in those 75 years. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what television has done to that landscape of representation that you're talking about. There are so many series now that are focused around Black characters, lots and lots of American ones, of course, Insecure in Atlanta, and so many others. What Clement Virgo did with Greenleaf, with Oprah Winfrey, Digstown, new Black series coming as well. Does that take up the place of the film industry, or do you see a kind of a significant difference between that sort of domestic viewing, watching at home on your couch, and going out for the occasion of a film?
I think they can coexist, right? But I think there is something about the big screen and that event, like what you were describing of like Black community knowing that this was like us and like it being an event and you going with cousins and friends and making a date of it. I actually remember that we used to do that with Black theater, right? When a theater production would come to town and it was all Black cast, that was an event where all the Black women were coming out. and I
taking up space in public as well.
That's right. It is very significant. And in fact, I remember when I actually went to the opening of Dear White People, there was a special opening and it was an entirely Black audience. And it was like a special screening at like 11 at night. And I remember how I didn't know anyone in that space, but suddenly there was Black fellowship in the lobby of the theater and all these people were just connecting. It was an amazing experience. It transformed how I watched the movie. And then after the movie with strangers, we were just debriefing, right? It's not the same experience when you're doing that with television. Television is often viewed at home in private, sometimes with others, sometimes with not. And also in the era of TV that we're in, the water cooler moment with TV shows doesn't really exist anymore. Right? So you're not often even having the chance to debrief a show that you've seen, unless you might go on your social media and only people who subscribe to that streaming service might have seen it, or they don't get TV. So there's just a lot of complications with TV, whereas film, I still believe, is a more unifying product.
Yeah, that communal viewing, you can't beat that. And like you said, what happens outside the theater afterwards when people are debriefing and talking and you feel that kind of buzz in the air because they've been affected by the movie and they have thoughts, they have feelings that they want to express. I think for all of us, that's something special that you can't quite duplicate at home.
No, you can't.
All right, last thing I will ask you, you've done so much research in this area and it frames, in a way, provides some context for our understanding of Viola Desmond and her act of resistance on that day in November in 1946. What do you imagine she would make of what she's become as a kind of an icon in Canada?
Just all the reading that I've done on Viola Desmond and also reading her books by her sister, I just think she would be completely beside herself. This was a person who was just trying to make a life for themselves. They were not even trying to be an activist. They were in New Glasgow selling products based on the company that they were trying to grow. So I think she would just be completely amazed, and that her life had such impact and continues to have the impact that it does. And I think one of the things about Viola Desmond's story that I think will always reverberate now that we've taken her up, right, as a symbol in Canada, is that she didn't shy away from entering a very public life. That story of her being arrested, it could have remained a private experience, as many Black people in the world do when they experience racism. They don't say anything. But through the community that she was a part of, she had the courage to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to go public with this. And look at how she's still impacting the world. So I think the takeaway is that sharing your story is always going to bring healing and legacy, not just to yourself, but to your community. Because if she kept silent, we would not remember her name today.
So true. Dr. Cheryl Thompson, thank you so much for all of the insights you've shared with us today. As part of Viola Desmond Day, tonight there will be a special screening of a new documentary called Subjects of Desire by Jennifer Holness, an award-winning film and very much about Black women and representation on screen. For more information on tickets, you can go to tiff.net. Cheryl, I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us today. And I'm glad that more people are learning the story of Viola Desmond and thinking about it when we all go out to the movies. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.